First, he shaved off the full beard he'd grown over several years. Then he used water from the toilet to style his hair into a trendy cut. Next, he retrieved the police uniform he'd hidden in the tank's compartment. After sprucing himself up, he transformed into a dashing prison guard. This outrageous stunt left his fellow inmates speechless. Finally, taking advantage of a moment when he brushed past a guard, he swiped the access card from the guard's waist, and just like that, Neil walked out of the prison with ease. However, just as he was a step away from freedom, a new guard stopped him. The air froze instantly. Fortunately, this newcomer wasn't familiar with his colleagues. After a brief exchange of glances, he waved Neil through. And so, Neil walked out of the prison that had held him captive for nearly 4 years. But having regained his freedom, he didn't rush to flee. Instead, he bought a yellow work uniform for a few dollars at a roadside stall and waited in the airport parking lot. His goal wasn't to board a plane and fly away, but to target a convertible sports car about to pull into the terminal. As soon as the luxury car came to a stop, he immediately posed as a valet and approached the driver. The owner, completely unsuspecting, handed him the keys and a $100 tip. And just like that, Neil, a prisoner one moment, was behind the wheel of the luxury car the next, cruising through the bustling streets of New York to the beat of pulsating music. A sensational, citywide heist would soon bind the two men who should have been on opposite sides together. News of Neil's escape soon reached the ears of federal agent Borch, which undoubtedly added to his headaches. He knew all too well how cunning Neil was. It had taken him 5 whole years to catch him back then. As the adversary who knew Neil best, the task of apprehending him once again fell on Borch's shoulders. But what puzzled him greatly was why Neil, who was always so meticulous, would choose to escape on the eve of his release. After all, Neil would carve dense patterns into the wall every day, which showed he was filled with immense anticipation for his release. Borch immediately concluded that some kind of emergency must have occurred to make Neil take such a desperate risk at the very last moment. By reviewing the visitation footage, Borch discovered that Neil's girlfriend, Kate, came to visit every week, but she hadn't shown up since her last visit. Since the visitation footage had no audio, Borch could only decipher their conversation by reading their lips. "Goodbye, Neil. It's all true." Those parting words made it instantly clear to Borch that the answer might lie with Kate. Sure enough, when Borch led his team to surround Kate's apartment, the genius who had just pulled off a perfect escape was sitting on the floor like an abandoned child, clutching an empty wine bottle, his face filled with desolation. He had come for his lover, only to find she had already left. It seemed Borch's hunch was correct. Neil had indeed risked breaking out of prison for his girlfriend, but he was still too late. Compared to going back to prison, Neil cared far more about his girlfriend's sudden departure. But just as he was about to surrender, his gaze fell on the metal thread on Borch's shoulder. As a top-tier genius in the world of forgery, Neil recognized the origin of that fiber at a glance. Neil then calmly told Borch, "This is the security thread from the new version of the Canadian $100 bill." And this became Neil's trump card to turn the tables. At first, Borch didn't think much of it, but soon, his assistant's report confirmed Neil's claim. This seemingly ordinary bank heist instantly escalated into an international incident. It turned out that Borch was being toyed with by a criminal codenamed the Dutchman. Not only had the culprit ransacked the bank's vault, but after making off with the loot, he had deliberately altered the combination. After hours of effort by a professional locksmith, the combination was finally cracked. 324. However, just as the vault was about to be opened, Borch sensed something was amiss, but it was already too late. With a deafening explosion, all potential evidence was blown to smithereens, and the code the thief had deliberately left behind happened to correspond to the 3 letters FBI. This was undoubtedly a blatant mockery of the federal agents. Clearly, they had all been played by the thief. Then Borch noticed an extremely fine gold fiber on his shoulder. He immediately asked about it, but the Harvard graduates present just looked at each other, none able to answer.
How many of you went to Harvard? Don't raise your hands, don't.
Just as Borch was fretting over the destroyed evidence, the master criminal Neil spotted the flaw at a single glance.
Tell you what this is, right now. Will you agree to meet me back in prison in 1 week?
Okay.
It's a security fiber for the new Canadian $100 bill.
To verify Neil's claim, Borch rushed to the prison. Neil, however, had long anticipated that Borch would come sooner or later. He immediately offered to help catch the thief, since he knew the forger's methods inside out. But his condition was that Borch hire him as an FBI special advisor and secure his release on bail. Yet Borch instinctively rejected the proposal. Perhaps Neil's abilities could be of immense help to him, but he knew all too well just how cunning Neil was. Back in his cell, Neil looked at the marks covering the walls and realized he would waste another 4 years here for nothing, unable even to find out how his girlfriend was doing. Despair plunged him into a deep breakdown. Meanwhile, back at home, Borch confided his confusion to his wife. He remained convinced that Neil hadn't broken out of prison just for his girlfriend. There must be a more complex conspiracy behind it all, but his wife asked him point blank,
"If you were Neil, you wouldn't have run for me?"
This question left Bork deep in thought, and he realized that perhaps Neil's motives weren't as complicated as he had imagined. So the next day, Neil was successfully released on bail, but with the latest model of electronic ankle monitor on his leg. His movement was restricted to a 2-mile radius. If he went beyond that, an alarm would sound automatically. Due to limited police funding, Neil was placed in a cheap, filthy motel, where there were more cockroaches than guests. For Neil, who pursued the ultimate in quality of life, staying here was more unbearable than being in prison. However, Bork rejected Neil's request to change accommodations. Clearly, Bork had severely underestimated Neil's capabilities. Neil was never one to settle for the status quo. He immediately turned and headed to a thrift store, where he happened to encounter a distinguished-looking lady donating her late husband's clothes. Neil keenly sensed an opportunity and took the initiative to strike up a conversation. With his handsome appearance and exceptional emotional intelligence, Neil quickly won the lady's favor. Not only did she give him all of her husband's expensive haute couture suits, but she also warmly invited him to visit her home. The next day, when Bork came to the hotel looking for Neil, he found only a note with a new address. At first, Bork thought Neil was playing some kind of trick, but when he went to the address on the note, he was completely stunned by the sight before him. It was a detached mansion he could never afford, no matter how hard he worked for several lifetimes, and it was a white servant who opened the door for him. Just as Bork thought he must have the wrong address, he was immediately interrupted by the wealthy woman walking toward him, who told him that Neil was right there. Bork suppressed his doubts and went up to the rooftop. This was the kind of high society life he'd never even dared to dream of. But at that moment, Neil was wearing a silk robe, leisurely reading the newspaper on the terrace, as if he were the master of the house. Bork's worldview completely collapsed. He'd worked diligently his whole life, yet lived in an ordinary house in the suburbs, while this criminal had achieved a life he'd never even dared to dream of in just a single day. It turned out that Neil had simply walked the rich woman's dog and entertained her granddaughter, and in return, he'd been granted free use of a guest room in the mansion. Hearing this, Bork felt a sense of relief wash over him. But just then, a fair-skinned, beautiful young woman with long legs walked right past him. The appearance of the rich woman's granddaughter filled Bork with both jealousy and helplessness, so he could only urge Neil to put on a suit and get to work on the case immediately. While Neil was changing, Bork secretly enjoyed a delicious morning tea. Dressed in an expensive suit, Neil walked downstairs with a dashing, confident stride. This left Bork staring wide-eyed. He scrutinized this strikingly handsome felon from head to toe, but in the end, he could only urge Neil to leave immediately. Indeed, jealousy drives people mad. The two quickly arrived at the airport. The reason was that customs had just intercepted the luggage of a Dutchman, which was filled with copies of Snow White published in 1944. Moreover, on his previous 3 entries into the country, he had also carried large quantities of books. Bork examined them for a long time but found nothing suspicious. However, the observant Neil spotted something amiss at a glance. The title pages of these books were made of specially crafted Spanish parchment, a type of paper that had been discontinued years ago. Neil immediately deduced that the man's target was this precious parchment, rather than the books themselves. Upon investigation, they discovered that the day before purchasing these books, the Dutchman had visited an archive to examine Spanish victory bonds from the same period. Bork compared the dimensions of the parchment in the books with those of the bonds and found they matched perfectly. These bonds were issued during World War II, since it was widely believed they had been destroyed in the chaos of war. Almost no one had redeemed them over the years. Currently, the only surviving copy is the one in the archives, although the face value of this bond is only $1,000. After years of accumulated interest, each is now worth as much as $250,000. If 600 were forged, the total value would exceed $150 million. Yet Neil determined at a glance that it was a forgery.